All right, everyone, let's get this show started. Welcome to our DevOps office hours. It's February 16th, 2022. My name's Eric Osterman, and I'll be leading the conversation. I'm the founder and CEO of Cloud Posse. We're a DevOps accelerator, and that means that we help companies own their infrastructure in record time by building it together with your team while showing them the ropes. So if that sounds interesting, head over to cloudposse.com/quiz to get started. Again, that's cloudposse.com/quiz to get started. For those who are new to the call, the format's very informal. My goal is to get your questions answered. So feel free to unmute yourself at any time if you want to jump in and participate. If you're tuning in from our podcast or YouTube channel, you can register for these live and interactive sessions by heading over to cloudposse.com/officehours. Again, that's cloudposse.com/officehours. We host these calls every week. Our call today is recorded. We'll automatically post a video recording of this session to our YouTube channel. So if you like and support our channel, please hit those subscribe buttons. Head over to youtube.com/cloudposse. Again, that's youtube.com/cloudposse. Also, don't forget to share these videos with your team. If you want to keep everybody on the same page, that's a great way to do it. So with that said, let's jump into some announcements. So boy, was the Terraform Provider released just in the last week here? Feels like it's already been weeks and weeks ago. So that broke a lot of stuff for us. If you haven't yet been bit by that, then I would be surprised. The Terraform AWS upgrade broke a number of things, including how resources are expressed, like for S3 buckets. It instead of doing inline blocks, it moved a lot of things into standalone resources, which is really nice from one side because it makes it easier to manage S3 buckets, for example, but is a breaking change. So if this happened to you, our advice right now is to pin your Terraform providers in your root modules as best as you can, or commit your lock files. So there's the Terraform lock.hcl file. You can always commit that if you want to ensure that things update at your cadence and not the open source community at large. A lot of Cloud Posse modules haven't yet been updated to work with Terraform AWS Provider 4.0. So if you're bit by this, do pin to 3.0. Any other related announcements to this someone would like to bring up?
I have one thing. When reviewing the issue where they discussed the S3 bucket refactor, and I'll post it in the channel. There was a mention, and you could consider this rumor. There was a mention that in the coming weeks they might be reevaluating their position on creating migration tooling. So if you're in the process right now of building your own migration tooling, you might shift that to the back a sprint or two, or you can just continue on. But it might be duplicate effort if they actually end up releasing something.
So when you're saying migration tooling, I mean, they've already released a bunch of migration tooling, and migration tooling was actually a topic of last week's office hours. So I want to make sure I understand kind of the scope of what that might be referring to.
To my understanding, I didn't realize that there was other migration tooling out there. From my reading, what I understand is that HashiCorp did not release any migration tooling with 4.0. Instead, they just said hey, here's a new spec. Good luck.
I see what you're saying. You're saying making it easier to migrate Terraform code between versions of providers.
Right.
Like a TF migrate, or like the original migration.
Right, because the S3 bucket resource is now decomposed into several resources, right? So in order to do that, you have to do the configuration syntax change as well as doing the state transition. So you have to get into the nuts and bolts of it a little bit in order to do it well. I'm curious if anybody else has started down this path of creating tooling.
Yeah, resounding no. All right, that's good. Good heads up on that. That would be much appreciated, I think, from us. I think this doesn't solve the whole problem, but I think this does add credibility to why you want to be using modules in your organization rather than raw resources. So for example, if you're using S3 buckets and you have 25 different locations around your organization doing that, and if you had raw resources for all of that, this would be a much more painful thing to carry out versus if you as an organization was relying on a bucket module that implemented this. You will still have the grief of migrating state, but you won't have the grief of updating your code aside from updating the module pinning version that you would have. All right. So it was brought up a couple of weeks ago or a few weeks ago. OpenTelemetry has a GitHub action that you can then add to any of your pipelines if you want to add support for OpenTelemetry. GitHub, Datadog supports, of course, OpenTelemetry. So I was really excited about that. However, one of our developers pointed out, well, Datadog has its own native support now for GitHub Actions and telemetry. I don't know if behind the scenes it's using OpenTelemetry. This is just in addition to, be advised that there's a way to do this. Interestingly enough, GitHub Enterprise is not supported. I didn't see that right now. Kind of ironic since this would probably be appealing, especially to enterprise organizations. I think this is a really exciting advent of the CI or CD movements is real robust monitoring. Like, it's sad that if you're using GitHub Actions today, you're kind of envious of Jenkins and Jenkins dashboards because frankly, they're better than what you get with GitHub Actions. But let's not, yeah, all joking aside, GitHub Actions is a lot more pleasant to work with. So with this though, it's getting serious about your telemetry and your CI processes, and you can create dashboards to look at this data, however you need to look at it to see what the release engineering velocity is of your organization. And I want to, this is something I want to bake into our offering standard this year, I hope. Has anybody already kicked the tires on this? I'd be really curious. All right. So I don't know what it is, what's it about, but I've been seeing a lot of talk about HTTP 3 lately, the successor to HTTP 2. HTTP 3 is an interesting change, technically an incremental change, but quite revolutionary in some ways, because today the entire web is based around HTTP, all your REST, all your API requests, your GraphQL requests, etc., are based over HTTP, which is fundamentally based on TCP. Well, the switch to HTTP 3 is exciting because it finally introduces UDP as the transport layer, and with UDP, it should reduce some of the congestion issues and the ability to more efficiently streamline parallel requests happening on a site. Now, HTTP 3 is pretty easy to understand, high level. It's basically just HTTP 2 over UDP, and more specifically, this other protocol called Quick, developed by Google, that runs over UDP. So HTTP 3 is basically HTTP 2 over Quick. And I'm excited about this. Many of the most mainstream browsers already support it. Cloudflare already supports it. And I haven't looked into if like any of the Amazon technologies support it yet. Anybody know? Does CloudFront support it? Do AOB support it? HTTP 3? I doubt it, but. All right. Next announcement is, so a few weeks ago, we announced that GitHub Actions was officially going to support Mermaid inline in your Markdown files. This is pretty rad. So basically you just use a standard GitHub code block, specify the language as Mermaid, as you would like HCL or something else. And then you get this pretty SVG generated right inside of this canvas generated right inside of your file. So here's an example of that straight from the horse's mouth. Mermaid.js is a open source project. And here you can see, if I just select over this text, you can see this is just an inline canvas here with graphics. I think this is phenomenal move for technical documentation. So we can be a lot more expressive about what something is doing, especially for us as infrastructure engineers. How rad wouldn't it be now to maybe have the Terraform graph automatically exported to Mermaid format, added to the Markdown, and you get these beautiful representations of your Terraform code. So I expect someone to come out with a GitHub action shortly to translate Terraform graphs to Mermaid and embed those. You know, actually, Terraform docs, this is what Terraform docs should have a feature for, right? Terraform docs should just be able to export Terraform graph and embed it in your Markdown file. So whoever has some sway, make it so.
That brings up a question that I have. Does anybody actually use Terraform graph? Like, I've never found the graph to actually be useful, but maybe I've used it years ago on larger projects where, you know, when you're looking at the full graph of 500 resources, it's not useful. But when you're looking at a graph of a much smaller Terraform root module, then it might be useful. But yeah, I've never actually found it useful. And when I teach people Terraform, I skip over it and tell them it's useless.
Well, I would say that Terraform graph, as much as Terraform is by itself, by and large, useless without something else that calls it. So I think that unless the machinery is there to take that Terraform graph and embed it somewhere, and two, that your modules are smaller, like your root modules shouldn't be the Teralith. They should instead be, you know, these small composable root modules, and then they become a little bit more helpful.
Yeah.
But then I think there's a circular argument here, or a catch-22, because they aren't maybe that useful historically. There hasn't been that much invested in them, and because there isn't that much invested in them, they aren't that much used, and it just repeats itself.
Yeah.
I found some use in the Terraform graph in trying to understand how it is that Terraform traverses the code. What gets done first, what gets done last. I don't find the graph itself as useful as the dot file that generates it, because the graph is just impossible to understand in any complexity.
Maybe it's an argument to me. Well, it'd be interesting. Since we haven't been using it, I can't say concretely. Maybe it's a way of understanding, though, the complexity of a module, and if that graph is unintelligible, maybe that says something about the module.
So
That's a good point.
One thing I did want to,
and maybe our modules would be very complex. I don't know.
One thing I did want to point out about Terraform graph is it's not what most people are looking for in documentation. So most people want to understand how the traffic flows from the web into the front web servers and then the backend database. That's not what Terraform graph is.
That is not it. Not at all. That's an astute observation. Well, but here's the thing. As someone who's written or designed a lot of graphs over the years, I'm not too crazy about the auto-generated graph. So that's one check in your court. So I agree with you on that, Ralph. Two is that you often want to see it in different layers from different perspectives. One of those perspectives would be the architecture of the underlying resources, but another one is the overall architecture that you're implementing, which would have some layers of, some artistic liberties taken to reduce some of the complexity in there and make it easier. There is seldom any substitute for a human generated chart to explain what's happening, because, hey, it's explained by a human for humans.
So I did this very recently. I deleted a lot of the information in the Terraform graph to make it more understandable.
Yeah. And
even deleting half of it, it still wasn't what we were looking for in terms of documentation. But
I've always seen it. Sorry, go ahead.
I threw out all the vars because to me that didn't, it was just too much, right? I threw out all the vars as my first step to go okay, let me see if I can make something understandable out of this. And still, it was still at the point where I still needed to massage it a lot to make it even somewhat understandable. And when you look at the Terraform graph examples that they give you, they're all very simple. like this one is understandable, right? You can just look at this and it's like, but I ended up with something that had so many lines crossing each other that I couldn't even follow them.
Yeah.
I would
The
argue
point of
the
Terraform
chart
graph
on
is to
the
give
screen
you
right
like
now is
the
not very understandable. Not at all.
right. But the point of the Terraform graph is to give you like a visualization of the dependencies between resources. And in particular, if you're using AWS Provider, right? You know how that API looks on the back end. It's very modularized. So you have many resources like to have these dependency orderings. Or actually, rather, it's not even AWS dependent, right? It's just how you do your ACL. So there's no logical superstructure that's missing, right? That you would want to understand the various resources that you're creating. And if anything, here's an idea for somebody who wants to code on this. If anything, your logical superstructure comes from the way you compose your Terraform files, and your modules. So maybe that's like some superstructure you could superimpose on top of the graph in order to make it more understandable. So that's an idea. Just throw it out there. But yeah, it's a different thing. It's not what you want to, how you want to think about your infrastructure. It's just how Terraform looks at the HCL. So
Yeah.
it's missing that logic.
And with that point, the thing, I think about Terraform graph is that it might be more useful to provider developers, people that are actually trying to understand, hey, how is the provider going to map this set of resources, and what's the ordering in which they're going to do it, and what are the edges of this resources. But as a Terraform implementer, it seems like this stuff is abstracted away enough from us that we don't really care, right? Like, yeah, it tells us what resources we're deploying, but I feel like there's better visualizations of that.
All right. Let's move into the other GitHub related announcement. This is something that came out a few weeks ago, but oops, I opened the wrong link here. Native support for SVG files in Markdown and GitHub issues and PRs. This is something that's been annoying for us. In order for security reasons originally, GitHub didn't allow SVGs to be served from within GitHub. You could call external SVGs. So we would have to upload the graphic to like our marketing site and then link it in our Markdown. Now we can actually just have SVGs directly in our repos and import those and reference those. So nicer, higher quality Markdown files and comments as a result of this. All right. The next announcement. Go on.
The Mermaid support that followed that is also really cool, I think.
Right, which is which was just the thing we were going over there with the
Oh,
Mermaid.
sorry.
I
joined late.
We were talking. One thing led to the next, and we were talking about the Terraform graph and how the Terraform graph could be converted to Mermaid diagrams, and then, well, are Terraform graphs even useful? Was kind of the question we were left with. The next announcement is related to EFS, and EFS is the file system everyone loves to hate. And, except for us, I'm still bullish on EFS, and I haven't seen all the reasons for all the hate. So EFS is Amazon's implementation of NFS, but it's really a re-implementation of NFS on top of AWS technologies. And they've done a lot of things really interesting about EFS, allowing you to scale your IOPS, both for read and for write. And that EFS, unlike your EBS volumes, is not zone locked. So if you are using EFS, for example, with your EKS clusters, it's a really convenient way to have pods with persistent volumes that can bounce around across availability zones. The other thing is that it can work with IO intensive applications because of the scalable IOPS. Well, this next announcement is that they have reduced the latency for some of those IOPS, making it even perhaps more of a compelling argument. Obviously, you use EFS more with applications that you don't have control over how they work. I mean, if you're developing your own apps, maybe you can write them such that they're natively working with an object store or block storage like S3. When that's not the case, this is the alternative. Next announcement is, this one literally like 5 minutes before office hours. So I saw this hit my inbox, and it solves a problem that I have. I got a new laptop end of the year, a little Christmas present to myself, and my SSH keys are still over on my old laptop. Now, this gives me an incentive to try out this new beta feature. You can keep your private keys inside of 1Password, and it'll work in cahoots with your agent to share those keys. So whenever you need SSH, it'll also autofill public keys, for example, in GitHub or GitLab, in those places that you need a public key for uploading or for connecting to SSH. Rather. Anyone else see this announcement? Excited about it?
I definitely would have wanted something like that.
Yeah, I think this is going to be part of our standard recommendation. And we are big proponents, by the way, of 1Password. We recommend in all of our engagements as the primary password store for secrets for humans, not for your services. But inevitably, an organization has institutional knowledge that is confidential or sensitive in nature, and we recommend using 1Password for that. And I'm excited that 1Password is leading the charge on this feature. All right, that's all my announcements. Anybody else have some announcements to bring up today? Cool, let's move into Q&A.
What was your observation before you go on, Eric? You had a observation to rise a specialized.
It wasn't bolded, it wasn't a red, so I missed it. Thanks for calling that out. It's nothing brilliant. It's nothing totally brilliant, but when I saw yesterday that Netlify is now coming out with their own GraphQL database service, so you can build more of your app just natively within Netlify, then I was thinking, well, this is just really interesting, because it is so obvious now that you have this rise of like hyper specialized clouds. Let's say like HashiCloud is a great example with HashiCorp's managed cloud for Vault and Terraform Cloud and Console and what is it? I'm not sure what else they do now, but probably even more than that. We got Cloudflare, which everyone recognizes as a CDN, but they're encroaching a little. Everyone's nibbling at AWS and Google Cloud and some of these specialized services. So then Cloudflare came out with their function service. They have their distributed key value database. They have their access product and so forth. So a serverless framework, they have their CICD pipeline. I think serverless framework will even host your serverless functions now too. Another example of a specialized cloud. So I think what this is interesting is for open source companies is that there's actually a path to monetization where if you build an ecosystem of tools for developers or for companies, there's a way to monetize them by hosting those. Anything to add to that, Matt, or others?
No, I've seen this in other verticals. Like there's folks who will, provide a layer on top of AWS to provide HIPAA compliance, for example. Mm-hmm. There's a couple startups that do that. And I was wondering if that's what you're getting at, but I think you're in the same vein. I've just seen it in certain more distinct aspects, but yeah. And it makes sense. I mean, everybody's moving to the cloud and some people don't want to deal with the overhead of, being fully on AWS and want some layer of abstraction in between them, which makes plenty of sense.
And ironically, all these services are probably still hosted on Amazon, to be honest.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Like other than Cloudflare, and some of them, that's their selling point. They say, hey, you're still building all the stuff on the cloud. We're just pulling it for you, or we're just like, managing it all for you. And you can get access to it if you ever need. And yeah, I think that there's probably plenty of room for growth in that space.
It'd be
I read
pretty
a-
amazing if just one thought. It would be pretty amazing if if Amazon or Google Cloud or any of these services ultimately made it so that their system was pluggable, such that you could extend their web console, you could extend their APIs with your own vendor specific extensions to just be even more tightly integrated with these cloud providers. I think that'd be pretty interesting. What were you saying, Andy Roth?
I read a interesting article earlier that I got reminded of during this conversation about Amazon playing both sides of something. So like they came out with a service that helps you do robocalls, and then they came out with another service that helps you filter robocalls.
Yeah, that's an announcement I forgot to add, I think, to our weekly announcements here.
That's
AWS
something
WAF.
Nokia does, isn't it?
That's something like arms dealers do. They sell guns to both sides of a conflict.
That's funny. That is interesting. Yeah, they do offer that, and then make it against the terms of service to abuse them. But what you made me think of, though, Andy, was another announcement that is relevant, I think, to everyone. Is they announced some rule set or something for AWS WAF for credential stuffing. So it'll automatically detect if repeated series of requests are attempting to just test, I guess, different credentials and be able to block those requests. So pretty common attack vector, useful for sites to have it, because these days, what the predominant way that sites are exploited is people are reusing their credentials across different sites, and then they script it so they just take every credential that this person has ever used and try it at every other site they might have ever used and figure out what other sites they can access. All right. Let's see here. Next question. Sorry to see you have to leave early today, Vlad. Got your message there. Was there anything you want to bring up, Vlad, before you leave? Unless you've already dropped. That might have already dropped. Okay, so let's jump into some of the questions here that we got throughout the week in our office hours channel. If you haven't yet joined our Slack community, go to slack.sweetops.com. It's the same thing as if you go to slack.cloudposse.com, and you can register there, get an invite, and in the office hours channel is where we post all of these questions. So somebody was asking in Slack, has anyone found a tool that can facilitate mass migration of data from one tier of Glacier to another? And for additional, well, did we end up talking about this one last week? Sounds vaguely familiar.
No, that's me, Manuel.
All right, so I believe this is, yeah, exactly. It's the original implementation of Glacier, formerly known as Flex. And how do you get data out of that into the V2 Glacier natively handled by S3 APIs and so forth? And did we get any resolution on this? Pepe, are you on the call today, Pepe? He is not, but yeah, he seemed to have looked into this and didn't find any better way. You know what is interesting though? There was a separate tool. It didn't make it on my list today. It just came up in another channel. It's called S5 CMD, and it's a hyper performant command line tool for working with S3 with parallelization and multiple threading and so forth. So if you find yourself between a rock and a hard place and literally have to replicate the assets, maybe this is for you.
I believe we actually have the person who asked the question on the call, Alan. If you have did you get a resolution to your thread there?
No, I'm still looking. We have some AWS contacts that have given us some pointers, like using S3 bulk commands to copy to a new storage tier and then delete the old objects. But it just seems like a really common issue. I'm just very surprised if there wasn't something general purpose that you could just point at a bucket and say, convert everything from this tier to this tier. So just shot in the dark, I thought I'd ask.
Sorry, not able to add really too much help on that one. All right, next question. Oh, anyone else have anything to add to that before I move on? All right. Nija, you were asking about, is it possible to set two origins? We helped answer you last week on that, but I think you were still struggling with some permissions issues on IAM. Are you on the call today, Nija? I think this is one of those in the weeds kind of questions. Anyways, it's best answered just through the Slack. I see a bunch of people are helping out here, so hopefully we'll find some resolution for you on that one. Next question, Tim Gurley asks, what are people doing in the wild with respect to certificate pinning? Tim's company is going in the process of undergoing a pen test, and the auditors came back with a nitpick that they should be pinning their certificates for services that they depend on. And I think it's an interesting one. I understand why it's quote unquote a security best practice, but to me, this is just asking for a world of hurt in reality, the equivalent of reintroducing expired certificates, but this time self-induced. For example, now it's third parties, and when third parties rotate their certificates, which you have no foresight into, unlike when your SSL certificates expire, you can have monitoring for that and warn you about before it's going to happen. But if you're doing certificate pinning and you're doing that for third-party services, it's really just a way of unforced outages on your site. So maybe it's a better thing, rather than enforcing it, maybe it's a better thing to monitor for it and validate it. Trust but verify.
I've only done certificate pinning for mobile apps. And even then it's like you pin two certificates. One is your backup in case you ever do have to swap out the primary for some reason or another. Because you can obviously just brick a mobile application because you can't update it as easily as you could on a web application. But that's the only time in a pen test where I've had certificate pinning coming up is like it's a best practice for mobile apps. And it's a pain. It's really not a fun topic.
Yeah. This is where, security is always going to be at odds with DevOps and automation, not for bad reasons. It's just, it's like checks and balances. So I would say take all of these recommendations and requirements with a grain of salt. What you're looking for is security in depth and multiple layers of this onion. And there's frequently compensating controls that you can take into account. For example, this monitoring-based approach that I was suggesting, or what Matt was saying, maybe multiple keys.
Well, I think the key there too is the statement should be implemented. Does not say must be implemented.
Good point.
So I think if you go through an in-depth analysis, risk analysis, and can document and put together a document that says, yeah, we're not doing that, and here's the reasons why, and here's the risks we're willing to assume because of that. I think that'd be less of a headache.
I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and they talked about some of this stuff, and the guy that was talking was making a point that he was saying operational stability is more important than security. If it's secure but it doesn't work, who cares? But it's a good kind of tool it's a good arrow in the quiver for, the reason why we're not going to do this thing is that it will negatively affect operational stability, and that's more important to us. Here's all the mitigating things that we're going to do instead.
And this is a good case for like an architectural design record in your organization. For you acknowledge the problem, you acknowledge what the best practices are, and then why you chose as Andy or Phil was talking about, an alternative path.
And as part of that, if something hits the fan, here's how, put together the plan to clean up the mess. And oh, by the way, rehearse it once in a while.
Yes, definitely rehearsing. That's the step that is so frequently skipped. So let's see here. Don is asking, what is the recommended way for EKS pods to create, update, and destroy on S3 buckets? So are we saying assets in S3 buckets or the S3 buckets themselves? Don, are you on the call? All right, so Don's not on the call, but the gist of it is I would try and keep management of the buckets themselves outside of your Kubernetes lifecycle. And I think it's with good reason, because those buckets should probably exist regardless of if that cluster exists, meaning, for example, what if you wanted to do blue-green clusters at some point in the future? That would be precluded if you had your state of the S3 bucket managed in your Kubernetes cluster. And I think, therefore, it's nice to decouple it. Now, there are CRD options for how to manage these things in Kubernetes. Amazon released their AWS controller for Kubernetes, ACK, and this is a CRD-driven approach for managing select kinds of resources in AWS via Kubernetes. And that's, yeah, check that out if that sounds like what you needed. So someone else asks, Brent Garber. I don't know, Brent, are you on the call today? Brent was asking, is there a way to do AWS IPAM, but just in Terraform? And I'm not sure exactly what the scope of this was. Terraform obviously does support AWS's IPAM offering. Cloud Posse is actually looking to support this in this year as a way of basically intelligently managing your IP space to avoid overlapping CIDR ranges from being provisioned in multiple accounts and multiple VPCs. So I think the TLDR is, I think so. I think what you want is possible, but we haven't validated it yet. Anyone else managing IPAM yet in Terraform? All right, next question. Last question of the day. Let's see.
Well, I
Oh,
have
go on.
something about IP addresses in multiple AWS accounts for our company. We have X teams with X AWS accounts, and I've seen it. I've approached it two ways in my career. I'm not sure if this answers the question, but I'll try to be brief and describe both approaches. At one company, we did not do IP address management. Everyone just used 10 dot, and we released the same. Well, they were working on different components of the same overall software package, and so everybody used 10 dot. Every VPC was isolated from one another, and there was no need for interoperability between VPCs. So that worked for us. Then for my current company, we have different teams working on the same distributed software system that do need to interact with one another. And what we do there is we create VPCs in a primary network account, and subnets, and then share out the resources for those subnets and let AWS take care of the native IP allocation that way. So everyone, if they need to be on the shared VPC, then they just create resources in the shared out resource subnet, if that helps.
Yeah, so I think this was this question was specifically, though, targeting, I think, a offering which is very new in AWS that I didn't know about until office hours a few weeks ago, is IPAM pool. which is a actual resource in AWS. So I think what you added was good context. Like you really have two situations. One is like, you don't need to worry about this because you can have overlapping IPs in multiple accounts, or the other situation is you do need to worry about it and then how to solve it. And this is addressing the latter one. I will raise you this though, that even if you don't think you have that problem today, it's really painful to solve tomorrow when you find out that you have it or you need it. So
yeah, I've done that before where I thought, or I accidentally, for a project, created 5 VPCs with the same sitter range and then went, oh, we're going to be bitten really bad if we ever want to connect these. Now we need to rebuild those VPCs, and rebuilding VPCs and all the resources that are connected to them is never a fun time. So thinking about that ahead of time is definitely smart. This is cool that there is an IPAM service within AWS. I didn't know they did that. And I would love to see this in the Cloud Posse module as an option to enable, or another separate module that like you could connect to the VPC module. Because this is just not having to manually assign those sitter ranges and think about them. Instead, just say, hey, we're going to start at this range, and as we increment and add new VPCs, it's going to pull from this address space. Would be really sweet.
Yeah, I agreed.
I haven't seen this either, so I guess I'll look at it. But I'm curious if it's just like if it's a subnetting tool or what's going on here.
Well, but you can also imagine just larger scope, like an enterprise, and that's who many of Amazon's customers are. So you have your Google clouds, your Azure clouds, your Amazon clouds. You got 3 acquisitions under your belt, and each of them have 2 AWS organizations with their IP space. And how do you manage the intersection of all those subnets to figure out what you should or can actually be able to use?
You just pray your acquired company doesn't have any IP overlap.
Exactly. So, all right. So that is the end of all the prepared questions we had based on scouring our Slack channels, office hours, and so forth.
We added more on the next slide though, Eric.
Oh, we had one more. Yes, on the other slide. Also, I saw you had a question, so let's get to yours here as well. My apologies. Oops. Over here. Next slide. All right. Oh, it was marked as skipped. All right. You had a question on, has anyone had to deal with uploading and offloading child accounts? And are you talking about child accounts strictly on New Relic or in AWS? I had over 50 on New Relic. Okay. I had over 50 accounts to create on New Relic and had to manually do this through the UI. I know Datadog allows programmatic creation of accounts through Terraform, but not programmatic deletion of accounts. Don't know enough about New Relic. Anybody know about New Relic's APIs and so forth?
I mean, it was really frustrating to the point that I had to, I kind of had to delete some of the accounts because the naming convention was changed. And for me I realized that the accounts were still, even when I tried to maybe reuse some of the names, I couldn't reuse the names. Or what I needed to do was that we had a new master account and I needed to move those other names to this new master account. And I could not reuse the names. It was really, I couldn't reuse the names, and I had to reach out to New Relic to talk to them, and they did, I don't know what they did. They just told me I could go ahead to recreate the names. So I'm sure they kind of, I don't know if there's a TTL or I don't think there is actually. I think they just went ahead to delete it from their backend and I could add it. So I had to be extremely careful not to put in something that I didn't need that I'll have to delete again. And then imagine that I have maybe 50 to 100 and I have to keep manually adding them to their UI. That is really difficult to work with that. I went ahead to check for every sort of automation that I could do to maybe upload the bulk of names, and I didn't see. I don't know if anyone has experienced something like that. If there's any solution or if they're ever going to, I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, Datadog tends to go after more of the enterprise market. New Relic being a budget monitoring and APM platform appeals to smaller companies, and therefore maybe they don't have some of those enterprise capabilities. But what you're dealing with there, like naming conventions or whatnot, that's a nightmare in general. That's why we at Cloud Posse tend to focus on greenfield migrations of services rather than try and make changes in place where you run into all of these issues with naming conventions and conflicts. Start fresh. But what do you do when you have lots of data in New Relic and you can't lose it? Yeah.
I don't know. I know a lot of companies are trying to adopt new Relic now, and they need to maybe fix that because it's going to be very difficult. I mean, you're going to maybe have to get an intern that will be doing that because it's really disturbing having to do something like that, like spend the whole time trying to upload, like add new child accounts for a whole lot of accounts.
Literally, must have been a pretty large organization you're working with that has that many New Relic accounts.
Yeah.
Unusual problem probably that they don't come across that often. So Sharif, you were asking a question earlier. I think this is a good one. It doesn't get enough attention, and I don't think I have the best answer. I mean, since I know you, Sharif, are very technical and know all these things. So you're asking here, like in your centralized logging system, for example, Elk and Loki, how would you deal with a spike of logs that overwhelms your pipeline? Do you drop logs? How valuable are the log lines for your team? And there's really no one size fits all here. The pattern that I've seen implemented for this, that we have previously implemented but don't currently implement, is basically fluent to Kinesis, and Kinesis then drains to Elasticsearch and S3. And this is where you can also think about kind of gracefully degrading, because you can think about S3 as being able to handle any sort of spike that you could conceivably come across within your organization. Kinesis then being able to absorb that if you're willing to pay the price for it. The issue is more Elk in the end. Can Elk really handle any of those upper bound ingestions? And that's where you'll probably see it fall over. Unless you can normalize those spikes and just consume them over time. Because the other issue is whether or not you can absorb the spike of logs. Is that spike, I mean, is the rate of logs so great that you never have a period of time where it doesn't calm down enough that you can catch up again? So.
Yeah, I also have a problem at the source of the logs. So sometimes the amount of logging will take down the Kubernetes node itself. So and I can't rotate the file like you can rotate the file like Fluent bit, or I use FileBeat, but it can't like delete the file after it ingested. It has to stay there. So sometimes it will explode, like they take the whole node down, or if the logging is slow enough, the pod will get evicted in time.
Well, okay, so in that situation, two thoughts. One is obviously re-implementing how logging is implemented there in the app, so it's doing it natively to the endpoint. And that way, all the limits that you have on the pod itself kick in, CPU limits, IO limits, etc. The other option is reconfiguring how the logging is handled. So it's always sending it to a pipe directly, never to a file. And then the pipe is consumed by FileBeat, et cetera, and drained to Kinesis or some other source. At that point, I don't think that it should be possible to overwhelm the node itself, because if you have limits there, it should be overwhelming the resource limits of that pod without adversely affecting the rest of the node. Is either one of those a possibility for this particular app? Is the app such an open source app you can share?
No, not really. Okay, so let me tell you the background of this thing. So we implemented this centralized logging about 4 years ago, and people didn't really use it that much. And like over time, they realized how useful it is. So they started logging a lot of information, like like stuff, so they can do aggregations and cool dashboards and stuff. And as we scaled, like these logs became both huge in volume and very important for the business. Like they started using it for business use cases and business analytics and stuff. And like some tickets will come up like I can't find this log line. Like a log line was missing, a single log line. They started caring about a single log line. So it's kind of abusing the logging to do this sort of use cases, in my opinion. So like we advise them, so if you have like a very important data, do not use logging to ship them to Elasticsearch. Like just use ship them to Kafka and like have a separate pipeline for this stuff.
This is the problem that I've seen happen, especially like organizations that have compliance, and then suddenly these logs, you know, they're contractually obligated to keep every single line event, and they have to keep it for 7 years or something crazy like that. You might be in that situation. So otherwise, yeah, what you were talking about, FileBeat, we've used Logstash for this. We had this issue previously. And basically, in our case, use this throttling plugin, which is nice because so long as you are within the bounds, you don't lose any logs, but then it gracefully degrades as your volume shoots up. So if you get a log spike like that, it starts sampling the logs instead.
Yeah. I'm trying to shift the teams to like, if you have a data that you care about, do not rely on the logging system to capture them all. So like I don't have an SLA for the logs, so that I have to capture every line of log, and it's okay to lose some logs, and data that we care about, we will ship it in another way.
I think that's good. Push back on an SLA for logs as much as you can, individual log events at least. Yeah. All right, let's tap into the last question on our list here. Ray Myers was asking about something that's come up actually many times on office hours, but you know, the gist of it is this, is that we often talk in office hours about how to do continuous delivery for infrastructure like Terraform, and that you essentially have to give that pipeline full AWS permissions in order to be useful in any capacity, versus fine-grained permissions that, you know, has been beaten into our head ever since we have started working with infrastructure as code and, you know, DevOps, that seem more secure but troublesome to manage. And if we had any resources or other trade-offs to talk about that. I'm not sure, Andy, if you know handy, if we have a Cloud Posse Explains episode on this, but the gist of it, the simple way to think about it is, again, through security and depth, and that there are different layers here. And taking, generally speaking, this concept of least access privileges to extreme is what works against us. And what we do is, what we want our services deployed to have the least access privileges there. And we want humans interacting with the accounts to have those. But when we go into automation, it is crossing the chasm of being somewhere, you know, performing the operations of what a human would do, and also doing something what a service would do. And unfortunately, if you want to manage IAM, that needs to be an administrative role. You cannot have fine-grained IAM permissions that say you can only manage these kinds of permissions on IAM, as far as I recall. So this is why in the end, you need to give your systems full IAM permission. However, that's not the end of the story, because what we have here is a GitOps driven workflow, hopefully behind the scenes. And that means that we can start to do policy enforcement and static analysis and other checks on your code before it ever gets deployed. And that's why, you know, the systems like Spacelift and Scalar and Terraform have policy-based frameworks for enforcing what your continuous delivery for Terraform can do. So in our case, it could be, for example, in lower environments like sandbox, dev, and possibly even staging, you are more relaxed in who can confirm and roll out those changes versus in higher order environments like production. There has to be a human review. I think the key thing is to get out of the way. And so long as you have the checks and balances in place such that others can review what is about to change before it actually happens, that covers 80 out of 20 of the issues, to quote Pareto's principle on that.
Yeah, hi. So I've actually implemented something where for the act of checking the checks and balance, I think even Cloud Posse has that, like a commenter that just shows up the changes that are about to be made on your GitHub comment session. Yeah, so I kind of implemented something like that. So when it gets 41 to production, you would just get like a Slack message, and only the staff that has the ability to actually approve that approves it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that transparency is essential, because seldom is anyone else reviewing that pull request going to check out the code and run the plan themselves, right? So that's why you need to have some level of automation in there. The problem with the GitHub commenting thing is, well, any developer who is a member of that GitHub org and that repository, subscribe to notifications, is suddenly going to start getting a lot of comment spam from all those programmatic comments. And if anybody's doing iteration on a pull request or things like that, it creates a lot of comment spam. So while we used to rely on a lot of GitHub comments to convey the outcome of a pull request, we've kind of walked that back because other tools have come across, for example, Spacelift, that have those things then just communicated in the Spacelift UI. But the gist of it is the same. You have to keep an eye on those things. I also hope that in the very short term future, we finally have our live demo environment online. And I'll be bringing up more examples of this shortly for how it looks when we do it through our tooling and infrastructure. All right, well, we are out of time for today. This has been an amazing session. Thanks everyone for chipping in and asking some great questions. I wanted to just remind everyone, if you haven't yet already subscribed to our YouTube channel, do head over to youtube.com/cloudposse. Again, youtube.com/cloudposse, and subscribe. It helps us out a great deal. If you haven't yet added me on LinkedIn, I'm always open to connecting to members of our community. Love to see what everyone's up to. If you go to linkedin.com/in/Osterman, I'll be glad to accept your connection request. We do syndicate our weekly office hours via our podcast. It's at podcast.cloudposse.com. It's available on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify podcasts, and 24 other podcasting services out there. So however you listen to podcasts. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our office hours calendar invitation, just go to cloudposse.com/office hours and type in your email address. You'll get an invite for our weekly sessions here. So look forward to seeing everyone next week, same time, same place. Have a great rest of your week.